All right. Thank you, Madam Speaker Pro Tem. This evening, we're going to actually do a handful of things. Some of this is just sort of responding to some of the absurd conversations I've had this week. And this is my moment where I apologize to the stenographer, the clerk. Much of this you will have already heard, but it bears repeating because I actually sat down with a group of congressional staff. And it was one of those sort of passing conversations where you sit down and there were Republican and Democrat staff there. And they didn't understand some of the most basic numbers of what's going on around us. So the first thing we're going to start with here. How many of you picked up a newspaper and heard anyone talk about the debt ceiling? Yeah, apparently it's a really big deal. Fine. But then you hear them say things like, it's the default if we don't just raise it. No, that's not how it works. Default is when you do not pay back your bonds. It's still really important. We're going to actually ultimately have to raise the debt ceiling. It's, can we do something? It's also going to be very, very, very important. Can we do it in a fashion where we message to the world debt markets that we're taking our debt seriously, that we understand the curve is unsustainable, and we're going to walk through a bunch of boards that basically show the scale of the debt that's coming. But once again, default is when you do not pay back your bonds. Now, we actually had a Treasury Secretary under President Obama that he and I remember had this wonderful conversation when I kept correcting and saying that's not default. He came up saying, okay, we're going to create a new term. It's now called a technical default. And that's when the 30% of government spending that's functionally borrowed every single day, we're not able to pay for that. Fine, call it technical default. Let's just be accurate. But the other thing that's really important, and if there's anyone in Republican leadership listening out there, please hear this. 2011, the United States actually got a downgrade. Standard & Poor's lowered the United States from its AAA rating. They took us down a notch. They did not lower our credit rating because of the debt ceiling. They lowered our credit rating because we didn't provide a credible path on managing the scale of the debt. And this is 2011. The numbers today are devastatingly more ugly. If you can sort of mix that in language. Seriously. So 2011, we moved down to a AA+, fine. But it was because we were doing nothing about budget deficits. And once again, I talked about this last week, and once again, I think it was yesterday, a member of the left going, well, they're going to get us downgraded if we just don't raise the debt ceiling. That isn't why we were downgraded in 2011. It's because we did not demonstrate to the world markets that we want to buy. Remember, we borrow more than, I think last year it was $48,000 a second. Every second of every day we borrow $48,000. Someone has to buy that debt to finance the 30% of our spending that we don't cover with our tax receipts. Wouldn't the people that buy those bonds like to know we intend to pay them back? Does just raising the borrowing on a limit, which is functioning just like on your credit card, raising the borrowing limit, does that tell them we're going to pay it back? What tells them to pay them back is we're building a plan saying, here's how we're going to basically deal with the debt over the coming decades. And the people that say, we're just going to balance. Fine, I can get you to balance, but I don't think most folks have any concept how bloody that would be. So maybe the better way to think about it is the size of the economy. We're going to maximize the economic growth of the economy and try to minimize the growth of the debt so we stabilize what we refer to as debt to GDP. Great concept, but this one just, I don't know why it grates on me so much, is we have these people that think they're geniuses around here. They're going to ruin the credit rating of the United States. It was The threat to the credit rating is we do not communicate to debt markets here and around the world that we're taking our debt seriously. So once again, an oldie but a goodie, and it's already out of date. But I wasn't going to kill another board and printer ink. And this will hopefully make sense. I need everyone to understand. Let's not even worry about 1965. This is last year. 71% of all of our spending was functioning what we call mandatory. Okay, fine. Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, things of that nature. But the punchline I want you all to understand is actually right here. Defense was 13% of our spending. The rest of domestic discretionary was 16. So I got a 13 and a 16. And I'm going to show this on a couple more charts. In 9 budget years, if you look at the CBO report from a couple weeks ago, makes it very clear, in 9 budget years, you can get rid of this entire portion of government, all defense, all discretionary, it's gone. And the growth of this will be so big, you still got to borrow a couple $100 billion. And the next year, it's dramatically worse. So that's what, 2033, which isn't that long from now, but in 2034, Social Security Trust Fund is gone. Are we going to let seniors take a 23% cut? Are you going to double senior poverty? Well, remember, the Democrats have made it almost impossible to have an honest conversation about entitlements. You can't have a conversation how we're going to save Social Security. The president got behind that microphone there and made it toxic. A year's worth of our work where we've been trying to come up with a way to save Social Security, and we've been doing it with the Senate, with Democrats. And he knifed us. That's really moral. So he stands there, I am going to protect Social Security and Medicare. You promised we're not going to talk about it, there'll be no cuts. And everyone applauds, yes, and fine. There have never been conversations about cutting it. For that year, I was the senior Republican over Social Security and Ways and Means. Not a single person ever spoke to me about cutting it. We were working on trying to how to save it. And now those very people I've been working with run away from the issue saying, look, the president's made it toxic. The year's worth of work, all the money we spent with actuaries, everything else, it's over. You know, Democrats aren't serious. They're going to use it as a weapon. You know, fine, we walk away. And once again, we sit and let the problem fester. And every day we wait, the math gets more difficult. And then we have the inane, well, we'll just raise taxes. A few weeks ago, I did a presentation here on the floor where I showed what happens if you raise the caps. Okay, so the new tax cap for Social Security, I think is what, $160,200. You pay your FICA tax. If you're self-employed, you know, or your employer pays half, you pay half. Just raise it. So every dime of income above that, if you do the incremental benefits, because remember, to be honest, Social Security wasn't a welfare retirement plan. It was sort of a forced savings plan. If you gave higher income earners the benefit on, even though you made $1 million, you paid your full Social Security tax on that, you only save about 17% of the shortfall. If you just pure tax, you only save about 33% of the shortfall. You've been lied to. If you actually dig into what was the Bernie Sanders plan, it's not just tax on all income. It's a tax on all income. So over here's the unearned income, over here's the stocks, over here's the businesses. It's functioning. Everything in society gets taxed. And here's the punchline. That still doesn't take care of everything, but it would take care of most of Social Security shortfall. Now, you got another problem. 3/4 of the future debt is actually shortfall in Medicare. And one of the frauds in the president's budget is they come back and say, well, we're taking care of the Medicare Part A trust fund with $600 billion, $660 billion over the next 10 years. Okay, except I need you to conceptualize this. Over the next 30 years, the shortfall in Medicare is $80.5 trillion when you do the shortfall in the interest. Okay, $660 billion is a lot of money over 10 years. It ain't 80 trillion. But this place is basically a fraud. It's virtue signaling. So one more time, I need this to sink in, and I don't know why this one has been so hard. Functionally, in 9 budget years, I can wipe out all of government, and you still have to borrow money. So if you get the brain trust that says, just get rid of foreign aid, we'll get rid of waste and fraud, we'll get higher taxes on rich people, fine, maybe that's the policy, maybe that's where we go. It doesn't take care of the problem. That's rhetoric you use in campaigns, stand behind the microphone and pretend you have any idea what the hell's actually going on. The math is the math. And I feel like I work in a math-free zone. I mean, and I've done this presentation before where you say, hey, I can get rid of all of defense. I still have to borrow, but the one that seems to sink through to some people, in 9 budget years, I can get rid of every dime of government, as you know it, and just to maintain the mandatory spending, the earned benefits and some of the unearned benefits, we still have to borrow $200–300 billion. And that was assuming 2 things I should throw out, and we're trying to recalculate. That was assuming on the previous interest rate calculations from last month that turn out that already look wrong. That looks like our financing U.S. sovereign debt is going to be higher. And I'm going to show you a chart here that it was also based on a much higher GDP. Now, understand, when we were getting a 2024 outlook and 1.6% economic growth, that's miserable. This is a country that used to run over 3% decade after decade. But we have a demographic problem. We've gotten older, we don't have as many children. Newest economic outlook, we're down to 1.2. You tell me how I make the math work in a society where the policies from this administration have telegraphed to the markets that want to make investments, that want to grow the economy, that want to just the animal spirits of let's invest, let's see if we can grow. They're abandoning us. The new projected GDP growth as of this month is we expect over the next year to be down to 1.2% GDP growth. And that may not mean much to anyone here, but when you have a $20 trillion economy, a percent or two is like real math. It's real money. And it multiplies on itself. Remember, it's like you all in elementary school, you remember learning about compound interest? This is like compound economic, because today's base is the next year's base, is the next year's base. These differences, if they go a couple years, are just devastating. But that's what we're heading for. And back to why this is so important and why I'm just almost constantly angry around here, and I'm working on it. I'm working on having a better attitude. Look, I'm still very optimistic about the future. We're Americans. We will work this out. But I do this just passionately hoping someone's listening. This board is a couple years old. The numbers are much worse today. I just was too lazy to print up a new one. We're functionally heading towards borrowing $114 trillion on this board. The new update is closer to $128 trillion over the next 30 years. But the reason I brought this out again was basically say Medicare, Social Security, the shortfalls, and the financing. And this is making an assumption that we backfill Social Security in 9 years. When the trust fund's gone, we're not going to let senior poverty double. Somehow we're going to backfill it with general fund. Because remember, the president stood behind the microphone. We functionally have made it toxic to actually work on saving Social Security. It is absolutely immoral what happened, but that's the world we've been given. And Medicare, remember this is the 2-year number. I'm still using it. When you add in the interest, is over 80 trillion short. The rest of the budget actually has a positive balance. It has, the model is it actually will have cash in the bank. So as we work through this, you're going to see one of the punchlines. We could come together and fix Social Security. It's a little complicated. I think there's actually, in my world, I think I came up with like 19, 20 plus little levers you'd like to adjust. I'm a big fan of incentives to people so that they want to stay in the labor force, they can, things of that nature. There's no cuts. There may be some formula where you do some redistribution of those who only work 20 quarters, but they're higher income earners compared to those who work 40 quarters and lower income. It's geeky stuff. If you want to hang out with me and the actuaries, it's actually fascinating. There's a path. I've actually even grown fonder of the idea of the sovereign wealth fund sidecar, but a year's worth of work, hundreds of hours with actuaries and other people is gone. So that's this side. Medicare, it's about healthcare costs. Are we ready to start having an adult conversation that technology can do miracles? We can disrupt the price of healthcare and do it in a moral fashion where we make things faster, better, cheaper, more accessible. And why is that so hard? And I know I've said this dozens of times here, but I'm learning in Congress, we're all so busy chasing virtue signaling and giving a speech. Hopefully I can get my 3 minutes on YouTube. There's a path, and I'll end on a couple of the boards, but I've done hour-long presentations here of disruptions of curing people. Concept, 5% of U.S. healthcare, 50% of U.S. healthcare is 5% of the population. These are our brothers and sisters with chronic conditions. Stunning math. Do you know what happens if you start curing some of the chronic conditions? So if you ever get someone that does this, well, the most expensive part of healthcare is those last couple of weeks of life. There's a little fraud in that math, so let's see if I can work through that. It is for the individual. It is not for the system. The system is those with chronic conditions. So if you're not one of the people with the multiple chronic conditions, the last couple of weeks of your life are probably really expensive. You're probably in hospital or hospice. It's heartbreaking. There's some really ethical questions when we talk about that. But that's actually not the driver of Medicare costs. 31% of Medicare is diabetes. How many presentations have I done here saying, what can we do to help our brothers and sisters out there? Whether it be changing food support, nutrition support. Is it now the types of monitors where you can track your blood glucose and you don't have to prick your skin? Is it having an adult conversation of, and forgive me, don't make fun of me if I screw this, GPL-1 appetite inhibitors, and I guess there's 2 or 3 different types of structures there on the molecules that are used to accomplish that. Many of them are actually off patent, so could you encourage more entries into the market? Actually, my understanding is the 3 big ones, there's about almost half a dozen more entering the market, all the way down to the presentation I did the previous couple of weeks of the phase 1 beginning on the stem cell trial that actually looks like a cure for type 1 if it works and you don't need anti-rejection drugs. And I just use this as an example because it's so prominent. I represent a tribal community that's the 2nd highest per capita diabetic population in the world. It's not a poor tribe. But is it moral to actually say, hey, turns out curing certain diseases, taking on the healthcare costs that are the primary driver of U.S. sovereign debt, isn't it really neat, the fact that I could be doing something good for society? I had done some presentations in the past showing income inequality may be most affected by health. So if my brothers and sisters on the left who scream at us all the time, income inequality, it's an unfair society. Okay, what happens if I can show you the data that health, not racism, not even education, though education was big, number one driver is probably health. Why wouldn't they join us to actually do something that's optimistic and visionary? So let's walk through some of the realities. This is just one more time, the same exact chart, just trying to explain my net interest on just the shortage here is $47 trillion. And this is underestimated because we're now basing on a higher interest rate model for the future. And if I get one more person who, I want to say this carefully. A lot of the political class, a lot of the people that write about this who actually have no idea what they're saying. You've been robbed of your Social Security. That actually isn't the math. When you have paid in and it goes into the trust fund and the trust fund goes over and buys a special T-bill, treasury bond, and it actually in the past had a little spiff on the interest. And then when the Social Security over the last couple of years has started to run short, they take their little certificate and call the Treasury and say, hey, send me some cash. And the Treasury sends cash. And now the Treasury, because the Treasury functionally doesn't have enough money because we're already living on borrowed money, they go and sell another bond to backfill. But here's a point that's important. And I know this is averages, but the averages are important. The average taxpayer, and this board is now probably 2 years old. The average taxpayer in America over their lifetime will put in about $625,000 in Social Security taxes. They get back about $698. So it's about a $72,000 spiff. Now, obviously, you would have made a hell of a lot more money if you'd been able to take in even a portion of those Social Security taxes and put them in the markets and other places. But remember, we had that conversation in the early 2000s, and there was an absolute war. The left, the AAR party went nuts. You can't do that. You can't. Fine, we didn't do it. You're all a lot poorer today because we didn't do it. But hey, the unions, the collectivists, basically stand up. Take responsibility. If you were on the left side, you fought us, great. This is what you got. But average American gets about $72,000 more than they actually put into Social Security. Fine. This over here is what crushes me. And I need to make sure you understand, this is a couple, not an individual. The average couple puts in around $161,000 in Medicare taxes when you pay your FICA tax. Now remember, the taxes you're paying are functionally only paying for the Part A, which is up around 38 to 40% of Medicare spending. We call it the Part A. But that average couple, they put in $161,000, they're going to get back $522,000. It's this gap right here, multiplied times 76 million of us baby boomers. That is the primary driver of U.S. sovereign debt. Now, how many in the political class are like me, dumb enough to stand up in front of a room and tell the truth? But it is the truth. It's math, and the math will always win. And I know I've said this over and over and over, but trying not to curse. I've had a lot of coffee today. If we're willing to actually just embrace the truth, I can head us towards solutions. I'm just fighting around here just to get people to accept the most basic math. And I feel like an idiot week after week coming up here and saying versions of the same thing when we should be having amazing debates about the solutions. But I can't get an agreement on the basic math. And this one I'm just throwing out because I did it a couple weeks ago and I got all sorts of crap. That's not true. Well, it turns out the economists have now done it multiple times, and yes, it was true. The Orwellian name Inflation Reduction Act, the left actually put in all these tax credits. Hey, solar panels and cars and batteries. Well, Goldman Sachs actually modeled it. Now, there's a punchline coming. It's not what CBO said, which, hey, it might be $300 billion. No, Goldman Sachs said, no, the way they read the language, 1.2 trillion spending. So you have the left here who complains that as, you guys did tax reform in 2017 and it grew the economy, it shrank income inequality, it raised the poor up, and it grew the economy, but rich people got some taxes and it was a couple $1 trillion. Well, God damn it. Sorry. You just did a bill where you're handing out potentially $1.2 trillion to a handful of the green energy super companies who write you checks. Another thing, just trying to get to understanding of the fragility we're at. You do understand, when I've been talking about that 9-year budget window, where we think interest rates now have gone on U.S. sovereign debt, just that small rise in interest rates that we now are seeing structurally, we think the 10-year deficit right now is structurally $3.1 trillion that year. Just trying to help folks understand, when you're floating this scale of debt, how fragile we've become. And this is just a bit to mock the administration's budget. Okay, current deficit held by the public, about $25 trillion. And we should always explain the difference. When you hear us talk about, oh, there's a $32 trillion deficit, there's parts of there that are actually, we're borrowing from trust funds and those things. And then there's debt that's sold actually to public bonds. That's the one that gets really dicey because market movements can change those interest rates. Debt in 10 years is basically $44 trillion. Do you remember the excitement in the Democrats or the administration's budget was they're going to have $3 trillion, actually almost $6 trillion in new tax hikes, several trillion in new spending. Now, this is where the math got really interesting. We still can't, and we're going to lower the deficit by $3 trillion. No, we were heading towards borrowing $20 trillion. They were going to lower that from $20 trillion to take off $3 trillion off that. And the left here says, we're lowering the deficit. Huh? Let's see. In 10 years, I'm at $44 trillion of borrowing. And within there, you may have, through tax hikes and slowed down the economy, and we're still working on the model of how much the economy slowed down, if every tax hike, those dozens and dozens of tax hikes I've shown here on the board, if every single one of them passed and every one of them maxed out and the absolutely unrealistic numbers were somehow magically became real, they might get $3 trillion out of it. I guess what I'm saying is, it's insane we're talking about trillions. But if I'm heading to a $44 trillion deficit in 10 years, and I have the left giddy that they will have reduced it by 3 with all the tax hikes, but there's still, that means there's still almost $20 trillion of borrowing in that time. I'm not going to even make you subject to this, board. And I need my brothers and sisters on the left to stop making up stories. Just as my side, if we say, I can balance the budget by getting rid of foreign aid and waste and fraud. No, you can't. We should do some of that. We should do. All waste and fraud should be gone. We really should review all spending. But we can't keep lying to the American people saying it actually does much of anything. Remember, every dime of foreign aid is about 12 days. Actually, in the next budget, it might be only 12 days of borrowing. You got to think that through. So this is just amusing because if we took, okay, let's get it right. Confiscating all income all income over 500,000. So we take our country and say, hey, you made 501,000, I get that dollar. Government gets that next dollar. So you basically, the mantra here is, well, we don't tax rich people enough. Let's just take all their money. 500,000 and $1, and every dollar up, we take every dime from you. In the budget we're working on today, you might get $1.5 trillion in revenues. It's actually receipts is the right term. But in receipts, by taking every dollar of income over 500,000. But we're borrowing 1.7. Taking every dollar of people over $500,000 doesn't get you to balance on this single year, and you basically have collapsed all the economy. There's no more economic growth. But it's just, look, it's the rhetoric around here, the virtue signaling around here that has no basis in math. It's theater. So let's actually do another board. And the reason I pulled out these couple boards is that conversation I had with these young staffers, where I had a couple of these young Democrat staffers who really believed if we just tax rich people a little bit more, it takes care of everything. Maybe they should pay more, but it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't get you anywhere close to it. So let's look at this one. If I functionally took all untaxed personal and small business adjusted gross income annually earned above the income. So if I take every single dime of business, small businesses and wealthier American or higher income Americans, and this is done in GDP, but that's the way when you're starting getting these numbers, I get about 5.1% of the GDP in taxes. This addresses all the base taxes we have and then add additional here. My problem is, in 9 budget years, our spending is at 7.2% of GDP. And then 10 years after that, we're at 9.3% of GDP. And the year after that, excuse me, this is projected deficits, sorry, not spending, deficits. And then the deficit in 2050 is 12.4. So let's see. I can take every dime of small businesses and higher income earners, take over 500,000, I can take every dime. And the budget window we're working on right now doesn't give me anything close to paying off the annual deficits, annual borrowing. Am I making a point here, just understanding the scale, the size of the borrowing, and it's mostly healthcare costs. And this is just almost the exact same thing, just in a different chart. Total tax revenues raised, combining federal tax, and this one board makes a point. When my brothers and sisters on the left say, well, if we just tax rich people more, you've got to understand there's a little fraud. There's actually a number of frauds in that number. When we say, well, we should put them at this tax rate. Okay. Did I add in my state and local taxes also on top of that? So we tried to see what actually happens, saying, okay, we're going to respect a state like California that for the high income earners, what is it, like 13 point something, and if they have a local tax, when you do the adjustment, I can take every dime of those high income earners, every dime, and I'm still letting states have their part of the tax. I get about 4% of GDP. My problem is my Social Security is sitting at, and my Social Security and Medicare is sitting at 6%. It still doesn't get me there. And we've done a presentation on, there's a couple of the left senators who walk around saying, well, all we have to do is tax rich people. They're taking every dime, not just income. They're taking everything from the investments, the holdings. Actually, some of them even do unrealized capital gains, which I'm still trying to figure out how you tax that. So, all right, let's actually do a couple moments of optimism. There are solutions. This one I brought here because, and I'm bringing again because it's getting close. So remember the outrage here over insulin prices. They're outrageous. And the brain trust on the other side, basically their idea was, what we're going to do is we're going to take $36 billion and give it to Big Pharma to subsidize them to buy down the price of insulin. So you're going to complain about big pharma and their outrageous prices on insulin, and then you're going to hand them billions of dollars. That's how the insanity. But it's actually great politics. We're going to beat you up, but I'm going to hand you billions, and you're going to write me political checks. Yay! I mean, does anyone else see the scam? But there's solutions like this. This is a co-op, and they're getting, I mean, I think actually they're in production this year. This is a co-op about 70-some miles from where I'm standing right now, and it was insurance companies, it was state Medicaid systems, it was hospital systems, all got together and said, hey, you realize most insulin is actually off patent. The big 8 generics out there, they're off patent. Why the hell aren't we just making it ourselves? This is actually, and I've done other presentations, I'll do some more in the future, about drug pricing, and the solution is not a command and control rationing model, but actually a market supply model of let's get everyone and their cousin in the manufacturing business. The elegance of this is functionally co-op. The fact they were coming online has now disrupted the insulin market. You actually see some other companies, and forgive me if I got the wrong one, Johnson & Johnson, I think, crashing their price because they were coming to market as $30 a vial, $55 a box. You do realize the co-op was bringing insulin prices less than the subsidized price that was going to cost taxpayer billions of dollars. That's the absurdity around here. Instead of doing a market solution that actually works for everyone, the left passes subsidized solutions that only certain people get the benefit from, and Big Pharma got the checks. Did anyone here show up at their basic economics class? Simple pitch tonight. Tell the truth about the debt ceiling and how important it is to communicate to debt markets that we're taking our debt serious so we can maintain a stable interest rate. Because you saw some of the charts of how ugly the numbers get if we spook the debt markets. Number 2, understand how devastatingly ugly our coming debt is and its demographics. Turns out it's not Republican or Democrat. We got old. And we promised lots of benefits and we didn't set aside the money for it. And we live in a society of miracles where if we can adopt the technology, whether it be the diabetes, whether it be the next generation of telehealth, whether it be bringing in lots more competitors into the pharmaceutical markets, it doesn't have to be a dystopian, ugly future. But how do you teach a body to think, and I despise the term outside the box. The box needs to be burnt down, and you need to think about what's moral, what grows, and what actually changes what's crushing us financially, morally, ethically as a society. And it turns out the solution actually is almost this unified theory of good. It doesn't have to be an ugly future if I can just get this place to think and buy a calculator. And with that, Madam Speaker Pro Tem, I'm going to let everyone go home and I'm going to yield back.
Does the gentleman have a motion?
Madam Speaker Pro Tem, I move we do be adjourned.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted.